My parents threw me out on Christmas with nothing. What Grandpa's old card revealed ended them. There's a specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. I learned that on a Christmas night 3 years ago, standing on my parents' front porch in Ohio with a duffel bag at my feet, watching my breath turn to fog in the porch light while my mother locked the door behind me with a sound that felt louder than it should have. It was 11 degrees outside that night, but the cold that settled into my chest had nothing to do with the temperature. It had to do with understanding all at once, completely, that the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just decided calmly, deliberately, that I was no longer worth the trouble of loving. My name is Marin Whitfield, and for 26 years, I believed a story about my own life that turned out to be almost entirely untrue. I believed that whatever stability I'd had growing up, the roof over my head during the lean years after college, the help with rent during a stretch of unemployment, the quiet financial cushion that always seemed to appear right when I needed it most, had come from my parents, Carol and Dennis. I believed I owed them an unpayable debt of gratitude for it, a debt they reminded me of often in ways large and small, until that reminder became the entire emotional architecture of our relationship. 3 days after they threw me out on Christmas night, going through an old shoebox of my late grandfather's belongings that I'd never had the strength to open since his funeral 2 years earlier, I found a card. An ordinary card, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of thing you'd think nothing of finding in a box of memories. What was written inside that card and what was folded behind it undid every single thing I thought I understood about where my life had actually come from. This is the story of how I learned that the people who threw me out into the cold had spent years taking credit for a kindness that was never theirs to claim, and what happened when I finally understood who had actually been showing up for me, quietly, faithfully, for as long as I could remember. To understand the shape of that Christmas night, you have to understand the slow accumulation of years that led to it, because nothing in families this complicated happens in a single moment. It builds, it compounds, it hides in plain sight until the pressure finally breaks something open. I grew up in a modest house in a modest suburb outside Columbus, the only child of Carol, a woman whose love language had always been conditional in ways I didn't have the vocabulary to identify until I was much older, and Dennis, a quieter man who mostly deferred to my mother's emotional temperature on any given day, adjusting his own warmth or coldness toward me accordingly, like a man checking the weather before deciding what to wear. My mother had a particular phrase she returned to throughout my childhood and well into my adulthood, a phrase that, looking back, functioned less as an observation and more as a kind of leash. "We've given you so much," she would say, usually in the exact moment I expressed any desire that diverged from what she wanted for me. A different college major, a boyfriend she didn't approve of, eventually a career path that took me toward freelance graphic design instead of the stable office job she'd always pictured for me. "We've given you so much, and this is how you repay us?" I never fully understood as a kid what exactly I was supposed to be repaying beyond the basic fact of having been raised, fed, housed, the ordinary obligations of parenthood that most children don't grow up being asked to settle like a debt. But the framing worked on me anyway, the way these things do, slowly, beneath conscious awareness, until by the time I was an adult, I had internalized a deep, persistent sense that my own existence in this family was conditional on continued gratitude, continued compliance, continued willingness to be molded into whatever shape currently satisfied my mother's expectations. My grandfather, my mother's father, a man named Walter, existed at the edges of this dynamic for most of my childhood, a quiet, steady presence who showed up at holidays with the same calm warmth every single year, who never raised his voice, who had a habit of slipping me a few folded dollars whenever my parents weren't looking and telling me, with a small wink, "Don't tell your mother." I loved him with the uncomplicated, easy love that children reserve for the relatives who never make them feel like a burden. And as I grew older, that love only deepened, even as my relationship with my actual parents grew more strained, more conditional, more exhausting in ways I struggled to articulate, even to myself. Walter died when I was 24, 2 years before that Christmas night, after a slow decline that gave the family time to say goodbye, but not nearly enough time to actually feel ready for the loss. I remember standing at his funeral, watching my mother cry in a way that felt, even then, slightly performative, slightly aimed at an audience, while I felt something quieter and more devastating settle into my chest. The loss of the one person in my family who had never once made me feel like love came with conditions attached. I did not know, standing at that funeral, that Walter had left behind something that would eventually upend everything I believed about my own life. The years between my grandfather's death and that Christmas night were difficult ones, financially and emotionally, in ways that I now understand were deeply intertwined with the slow unraveling of my relationship with my parents. I was 24 when Walter died, working as a freelance graphic designer with inconsistent income, living in a small apartment I could barely afford on my own. My parents, throughout this period, positioned themselves as my primary financial safety net, a role they performed with great visibility and, I would later learn, considerably less actual substance than they claimed. When my car broke down 8 months after Walter's funeral and I needed $1,100 for repairs I couldn't otherwise afford, my mother called to tell me, with the specific tone of someone bestowing an enormous favor, that she and my father had figured out a way to help and that the money would appear in my account within a few days. It did appear exactly as promised, and I spent the better part of a phone call thanking her profusely the way I'd been trained to since childhood, while she accepted the gratitude with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to receiving it. When I went through a 3 month stretch of unemployment the following year after losing my biggest client, my parents again stepped in, this time covering my rent for those 3 months, a total of just under $3,600, delivered again with my mother's particular flair for making sure I understood the magnitude of the sacrifice. Your father and I had to dip into savings for this, she told me. We're happy to do it, but I hope you understand what it means. I did understand, or at least I understand the version of events she presented to me. I had no reason at the time to question where the money was actually coming from. My parents were not wealthy people. My father worked in mid level logistics management. My mother had retired early from a teaching career on a modest pension. And the fact that they seemed to have these reserves of emergency cash available exactly when I needed them, more consistently than their stated income would suggest was reasonable, never struck me as strange. I simply absorbed it into the larger narrative I'd been given since childhood, that my parents had given me so much that I owed them accordingly, that gratitude and compliance were the only acceptable currency I had to offer in return. There were other instances over those 2 years. A few $100s here for a medical bill, $600 there for a security deposit when I moved apartments, a recurring pattern of exactly timed financial rescue that I now understand, looking back with a clarity that only comes after the truth finally surfaces, was far too consistent, far too perfectly calibrated to my exact needs, to have come from the modest, fluctuating resources my parents actually possessed. I did not question any of it, not really, not until the Christmas that changed everything. The Christmas in question began ordinarily enough, which is perhaps the detail that still unsettles me most when I look back on it. There was no dramatic build-up that day, no fight in the morning that escalated by evening. I arrived at my parents' house in the early afternoon, the way I had every Christmas for as long as I could remember, carrying gifts I'd spent weeks choosing carefully, looking forward, as much as our complicated relationship allowed, to a quiet holiday together. The trouble started, as these things so often do in families like mine, over something that seemed disproportionately small in the moment and only later revealed itself as the final pressure point in a much longer, slower accumulation of resentment. During dinner, my father mentioned almost casually that he and my mother had been discussing downsizing, selling the house, moving somewhere smaller now that I was grown and living independently, and that part of those plans involved using the proceeds to help fund an early retirement they'd been quietly planning. I asked, with what I genuinely believed was simple curiosity, what that might mean for the savings they'd always told me they kept aside for family emergencies. The same savings, ostensibly, that had funded the various rescues over the previous 2 years. It was an innocent question. I had no idea asking it that I was pulling on a thread that would unravel an entire fabricated narrative. My mother's face changed in a way I'd learned over 26 years to recognize as dangerous. "What's savings?" she asked, her voice taking on an edge I knew well. "The emergency fund?" I said, confused now. "The money you and Dad have helped me with over the past couple years. The car repair, the rent when I was between clients. We don't have an emergency fund, Marin," my father said, and something in his tone, defensive, almost panicked, told me this conversation had suddenly become about something much larger than I understood. "We've been stretched thin helping you. We've made real sacrifices." I want to be honest that I don't fully remember the exact order of what was said over the next 20 minutes because the conversation escalated faster than I could process, moving from confusion to accusation to something that felt, by the end, like an entirely different argument than the one that had started it. What I do remember with total clarity is my mother eventually saying, her voice rising, "Do you have any idea what we've given up for you? Your father and I have sacrificed for years to keep bailing you out, and you can't even be grateful enough to stop asking questions about it." I said something back, I don't remember exactly what, something defensive, something about simply asking a question, not accusing them of anything. And the argument spiraled from there into old grievances neither of us had ever properly addressed. My career choices, my irresponsibility with money, a dozen small resentments that had clearly been accumulating far longer than that single dinner conversation could account for. It was my mother who said it first, though my father didn't disagree. Maybe it would be better, she said, her voice gone cold and final in a way that still, 3 years later, sends a chill through me when I remember it. If you spend the holidays somewhere else from now on, somewhere you can be grateful for what you have instead of interrogating us about it. I genuinely believed in the moment that this was an exaggerated threat born of holiday stress and an argument that had gotten out of hand, the kind of thing people say and later walk back once emotions cool. I did not understand until I was standing on the porch 20 minutes later with my coat half buttoned and my overnight bag in hand that my mother meant it literally, immediately, and without any apparent intention of reconsidering. I think you should go, my father said, not meeting my eyes, and the cowardice in his refusal to look at me as he said it told me everything about how this decision had actually been made, not jointly, not with any real conviction on his part, but as a capitulation to my mother's anger that he lacked the spine to resist. I left without my coat fully zipped. Without the leftovers my mother would have insisted I take in any previous year, without a single word of softening from either of them as I walked to my car in 11-degree weather on Christmas night, the porch light clicking off behind me before I'd even reached the driveway. I spent that Christmas night and the 2 days following it in a kind of numb, disoriented grief that I struggled to even name properly, staying in a budget motel because I couldn't bring myself to call any friends on Christmas to explain what had happened. Couldn't yet find the words for a situation that felt too humiliating, too strange to say out loud. It was on the third day, finally back in my own apartment, sitting in the particular kind of stillness that follows a shock once the initial adrenaline wears off, that I found myself, almost without deciding to, pulling out a box I'd kept sealed since my grandfather's funeral 2 years earlier, a box of Walter's personal effects that my mother had given me shortly after his death, mostly old photographs and effects my mother had given me shortly after his death, mostly old photographs and a few small mementos she said she thought I'd want, items she deemed too sentimental or insignificant to keep herself. I don't know exactly why I opened it that particular day. I think looking back, I needed to feel close to someone who had loved me without conditions. And Walter, even 2 years gone, was the only person who fit that description. Near the bottom of the box, beneath the stack of old photographs, I found a card. A simple birthday card. The kind you'd buy at any drugstore, slightly faded, addressed to me in my grandfather's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. I didn't immediately recognize which birthday it was from. There was no year written anywhere on it. I opened it expecting a brief, warm message. The kind Walter always wrote. Short, sincere, never elaborate. What I found instead was longer than any note he'd ever given me, and it began with a sentence that stopped me cold. Marin, if you're reading this and I'm not around to explain it myself, there are some things I think you deserve to know. The letter, because by that point it had become clear this was far more than a birthday card, explained that Walter had set up a modest trust years earlier, funded gradually from his pension and a small life insurance policy from my grandmother's passing, specifically intended to support me through the early, financially unstable years of adulthood. He explained that he had not wanted to give me the money directly, worried, in his words, that your mother would find a way to make it about something other than just helping you. And so he had instead arranged, with the help of a financial advisor he trusted, for the trust to disperse funds through my parents, with instructions that the money be used for my benefit whenever I needed it. He had trusted my parents to pass that money along without making it about themselves. He had trusted them, and they had taken every single dollar of it and presented it to me as their own sacrifice, their own generosity, building an entire narrative of debt and gratitude on the foundation of money that had never been theirs to give in the first place. Folded behind the letter was a printed statement from the trust, a financial summary Walter must have included for documentation, showing distributions made over the 2 years before his death and continuing, through instructions he'd left in place, for nearly 2 years after. The car repair, the 3 months of rent, the medical bill, the security deposit. Every single sacrifice my parents had used to build their case for how much I owed them had come directly from my grandfather's trust, routed through their accounts, and represented to me as their own. I sat on my apartment floor for a long time after reading that letter, feeling something complicated and enormous move through me. Grief for Walter, freshly reopened, mixed with a rage I had never let myself feel toward my parents before, mixed with something that felt almost like vindication. Except vindication felt too small a word for what had just been revealed. I did not call my parents immediately. I want to be honest about that. because I think the satisfying version of this story would have me confronting them within hours of discovering the truth. But what actually happened was slower, quieter, more deliberate. I spent the better part of a week simply sitting with what I'd learned, rereading Walter's letter more times than I could count, calling the financial advisor named in the documents to confirm what I already knew was true. The advisor, a calm, careful man named Greg Pellman, confirmed everything within a single phone call. The trust had been real, properly documented, and had disbursed a total of just over $22,000 over 4 years. Money intended entirely for me, money my parents had received and passed along only when it suited the narrative they wanted to build. Taking full credit each time, never once mentioning my grandfather's name in connection with any of it. When I finally called my mother 9 days after that Christmas, I did not lead with anger, though anger was very much present beneath the surface of everything I said. I led with a single question. Did you know Grandpa set up a trust for me? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I knew immediately, completely, that she had known the entire time. What followed was a conversation that revealed piece by piece the full architecture of the deception, how my parents had been approached by Walter's financial advisor shortly after the trust was established, how they had agreed to act as the conduit for the funds specifically because Walter wanted the money to feel like ordinary family support rather than a formal inheritance that might create complicated feelings, and how my parents had taken that arrangement and twisted it into something else entirely. A years long performance of sacrifice and generosity that had never cost them a single dollar of their own money, used specifically to extract gratitude, compliance, and emotional leverage from me, used specifically to gratitude, compontalic karmladits and an. We were going to tell you eventually, my mother said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, though I noticed, even then, that her first instinct was justification rather than apology. Your grandfather wanted it handled delicately. We didn't want you to feel like you owed him something either. I didn't owe either of you anything, I told her. And I felt, saying it, a clarity I had been reaching toward my entire adult life without quite arriving at it until that exact moment. But you spent years making sure I believed I did. You took his love and you wore it like it was yours. The aftermath of that discovery unfolded slowly over the following months in ways that fundamentally altered the shape of my relationship with my parents, though not in the clean, decisive way that stories like this sometimes suggest. I did not cut them off entirely, not immediately, though I understand why some people in similar situations choose to. What I did instead was begin requiring a kind of honesty from our relationship that had simply never existed before, refusing to engage with any further conversations about what I owed them, refusing to accept help framed as sacrifice when I now understood how thoroughly that framing had been built on a lie. My father, in the weeks following that phone call, sent me a long, halting email that read, in part, like a man trying to convince himself as much as me that his participation in the deception had been more passive than active. My mother's responses remained, for a long time, defensive in ways that frustrated me. Though eventually, nearly a year later, during a difficult, raw conversation I initiated specifically because I needed to say it out loud, she finally said something close to genuine acknowledgement. I think I was afraid that if you knew the money was his, you'd love him more than you loved us. I think I made it about us because I was scared of what was actually true. It was not the full apology I might have wanted. But it was, finally, an honest sentence, the first one I'd received from her in longer than I could remember. I used the remaining trust funds, once everything was properly transferred into my name with Greg Pellman's help, to do something I think Walter would have genuinely appreciated. I paid off the last of my freelance business debt, the lingering weight that had made me vulnerable to my parents' leverage in the first place, and I put the remainder into real savings, the first emergency fund I'd ever had that was actually fully mine, with no strings, no narrative of debt attached to it. I think about Walter often, especially around Christmas, the holiday that broke something open in my family in a way that ultimately, painfully, also set something free. I think about the quiet, careful way he tried to protect me even after he was gone, and the way that protection was twisted, briefly, into something else entirely before the truth finally found its way back to where it belonged. My parents and I speak occasionally now, carefully, in a relationship that bears little resemblance to what it once was. There is no clean resolution to offer here, no tidy bow tied around forgiveness fully granted or boundaries fully restored. What there is instead is simply this. I know now with absolute certainty who actually showed up for me quietly, faithfully, for as long as I can remember. And no amount of borrowed credit, however many years it went unquestioned, can change whose love that really was. I share this story not for sympathy and not even really for justice, though there is something undeniably satisfying in finally knowing the truth. I share it because I think there are more people than we realize living inside a story someone else has written for them. A story about debt, about gratitude, about what they supposedly owe simply for having been loved. Sometimes the only way out of that story is for the truth, however it arises, however painful the timing, to finally insist on being heard. I was thrown out on Christmas with nothing. What I found 3 days later reminded me that I had never, in any way that actually mattered, been without everything all along.